The harsh winds of the mining colony whipped through the barren landscape, a constant reminder of the lifeless planet that Lorana now called home. Every day was the same for her: chains on her wrists, heavy tools in her hands, and the cold eyes of the guards watching her every move. She was just one of the many prisoners forced to toil in the depths of the mines, digging for the precious ores that fueled the Empire's endless conquests. Lorana barely remembered what freedom felt like. Her home planet, lush with emerald forests and vibrant skies, was nothing more than a fading memory. The war had come swiftly, and with it, the Overlord's forces. Her people had resisted, but they were no match for the advanced technology and ruthless tactics of the Empire. Those who survived were enslaved, and Lorana was dragged away to this desolate place, her spirit as battered as the unforgiving terrain. Today was no different. Sweat dripped down her forehead as she swung her pickaxe against the rock, her muscles aching from the unending labor. The other prisoners worked in silence around her, their faces hollow and eyes downcast. Hope was a dangerous thing here, dangerous and scarce. Above ground, the colony's overseers welcomed a new visitor. Ethan Carter, a human engineer from Earth, stepped off the shuttle, his boots crunching against the rocky ground. Earth had formed a fragile alliance with the alien empire, a necessary arrangement to avoid being seen as a threat. Ethan had been sent to inspect the mining operations, ensuring the resources promised to Earth were being delivered as agreed. Ethan wasn't a soldier or a diplomat. He was just a man who loved machines more than politics. His job was simple: assess the equipment, suggest improvements, and leave. But as he followed the overseers through the colony, something didn't sit right with him. The air felt too heavy, the guards too tense. He noticed the way they avoided certain areas, how their voices dropped when they spoke of the mines. Curiosity had always been Ethan's greatest strength, and sometimes his greatest flaw. As the tour continued, his eyes wandered to the shadows, to the corners where guards barked orders at figures hunched under the weight of their chains. Something was wrong here, and Ethan's gut told him it wasn't just faulty machinery. His suspicions grew when the tour brought him to the edge of the mines. From a high vantage point, he could see the prisoners below, their movements mechanical, their bodies worn down to the bone. One figure caught his eye, a woman with silver-gray skin and shimmering violet hair that seemed out of place in the sea of grime. She moved with a quiet determination, her eyes fixed on her task, but her posture defiant in a way that set her apart from the others. Lorana felt his gaze before she saw him. She glanced up, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. She didn't know why, but the human's expression struck her. He looked different, not like the overseers or the guards, whose faces were etched with cruelty or indifference. This man's face showed something else: curiosity, perhaps even concern. But Lorana quickly lowered her head, returning to her work. She had learned long ago that attention, even well-meaning, often brought trouble. Ethan couldn't shake the image of her. As the tour continued, he asked questions, too many, apparently, as the overseer's responses grew curt and evasive. When he pressed about the conditions in the mines, the overseer waved him off, claiming the prisoners were criminals and rebels who deserved their fate. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat in his quarters, staring out the small window at the distant lights of the mines. He thought about the woman's eyes, the hollow despair he'd seen in the prisoners, and the overseer's dismissive attitude. Something wasn't adding up, and Ethan wasn't the kind of man to leave a mystery unsolved. In the dim glow of his tablet, he began to research. The colony's records were sparse, but he found hints, complaints filed, and quickly buried, discrepancies in supply shipments, and reports of uncooperative prisoners disappearing without explanation. The deeper he dug, the more uneasy he felt. Meanwhile, Lorana lay on the cold floor of her cell, staring at the cracked ceiling. For the first time in years, she allowed herself a sliver of curiosity about the human she'd seen. She had no reason to trust him, but something about his presence felt different. It was a dangerous thought, and she pushed it aside. The winds outside howled through the night, carrying the whispers of secrets buried deep within the mines. Neither Ethan nor Lorana knew it yet, but their paths were about to collide in a way that would change everything. The harsh clang of metal tools echoed through the mines as the prisoners worked tirelessly under the watchful eyes of the guards. The air was thick with dust, making it hard to breathe, but no one dared to stop. Lorana kept her head down, her arms aching with every swing of her pickaxe. She didn't notice the pair of human eyes watching her from a distance. Ethan Carter stood at the entrance of the mine, pretending to inspect the machinery while his mind raced. He couldn't forget the prisoners he'd seen, especially the silver-skinned woman with the haunting violet eyes. The overseer's words echoed in his mind, dismissing the prisoners as rebels and criminals. But something about this place didn't add up, and Ethan's instincts told him there was more to the story. He decided to investigate further. Claiming he needed to examine the mine's ventilation system, Ethan requested access to the lower levels. The overseers hesitated but ultimately allowed it, thinking he was just another Earth engineer too focused on his work to notice the harsh realities around him. As Ethan descended into the mines, the air grew heavier, the walls darker. He could feel the weight of despair in the atmosphere. The prisoners barely glanced at him as he passed, their faces too worn to register anything but exhaustion. But one pair of eyes followed him, Lorana's. She noticed the human moving through the tunnels, his steps deliberate yet hesitant, as if he were searching for something. Curiosity tugged at her, though she quickly pushed it aside. Humans were no different from the other species that served the Empire, she told herself, silent witnesses to suffering, unwilling to intervene. But Ethan wasn't just watching. He paused near one of the prisoners, a young man who looked no older than 20. The man's hands trembled as he struggled to lift a heavy load of ore. Ethan's gaze hardened. He approached the nearest guard, trying to mask his anger with calm words. "Why is he working with his injuries?" Ethan asked, nodding toward the young man. The guard sneered. "He's a prisoner. He works or he faces the consequences. Keep to your machines, human." Ethan clenched his fists but said nothing. Drawing attention to himself could jeopardize his mission, but he couldn't ignore the injustice. He stepped away, his mind racing with ideas. Later that evening, Ethan accessed the colony's restricted database using his engineering credentials. What he found shocked him. The records listed the prisoners as rebels, but their so-called crimes were trivial: protesting, refusing to submit to the Empire, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Many were civilians, farmers, and merchants. His chest tightened as he read the names, realizing these weren't criminals. They were victims. Among the names was one that caught his eye: Lorana Aaron, accused of leading resistance efforts against the Empire. Her profile included a picture of her before her capture, her face unmarked by the harsh lines of captivity, her eyes filled with defiance. Ethan couldn't ignore the evidence. He had to do something, but the risk was immense. If he was caught, he'd not only lose his career but possibly his life. Yet the thought of leaving these people to suffer was unbearable. The next day, Ethan returned to the mines, this time under the pretense of inspecting the machinery more closely. He lingered near Lorana's workstation, waiting for an opportunity to speak to her. "Your tools are dull," he said casually, loud enough for her to hear, but not so loud as to draw the guard's attention. Lorana glanced at him, her expression cautious. "They're not meant to work well," she replied quietly, her voice carrying a bitter edge. "We're not meant to last long." Ethan's stomach churned at her words, but he kept his tone neutral. "I might be able to fix that." Lorana frowned, unsure of his intentions. She had learned not to trust easily, especially not strangers who claimed to help. Still, something in Ethan's voice, his steady calm, his lack of condescension, made her hesitate. As the guards moved away, Ethan leaned closer. "If I wanted to help, could you trust me?" Lorana's eyes widened, and for a moment, fear flickered across her face. She looked away, pretending to focus on her work. Trust is dangerous here, human. If you're wise, you'll walk away. I can't, Ethan replied, his voice firm. I've seen enough to know this isn't right. I'm not walking away. Lorana studied him out of the corner of her eye, her thoughts racing. She didn't understand why this human cared, but she couldn't deny the sincerity in his tone. For the first time in years, a tiny spark of hope stirred within her, a hope she was afraid to acknowledge. As Ethan left the mines, his resolve hardened. He knew helping the prisoners would be dangerous, but he couldn't live with himself if he turned a blind eye. In the shadows of the mines, a silent promise was made, a promise that would set the stage for a daring escape and change their lives forever. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the mines, the prisoners, and especially Lorana. Her words haunted him. Trust is dangerous here. He knew she was right, but he also knew he couldn't ignore what he'd seen. The colony wasn't just a mining operation, it was a nightmare. And someone had to wake the galaxy up to it. He spent the next few days carefully observing the colony's routines. The guards rotated on predictable schedules, and the prisoners were moved at the same times each day. Ethan pretended to focus on his engineering work, but in reality, he was mapping every tunnel, every exit, every weak spot in the security systems. Meanwhile, Lorana kept her distance. She had survived this long by staying invisible, and now wasn't the time to stand out. But she couldn't ignore the human. Ethan wasn't like the others. He didn't bark orders or look away when cruelty unfolded. He watched. He questioned. And when he spoke to her, there was no hint of the arrogance she'd come to expect from outsiders. Late one night, as the other prisoners slept in their cramped cells, Lorana sat awake, staring at the cracks in the wall. She thought about Ethan's words. Could she trust him? Could she afford not to? The idea of escape was dangerous. Any attempt would mean certain death if they were caught. But wasn't she already dying, piece by piece, every day in this place? The next morning, Ethan waited near the entrance of the mines, pretending to check a faulty panel. He saw Lorana being marched to her workstation, her chains clinking softly against the ground. She glanced at him briefly, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, maybe even understanding. As the guards turned their attention elsewhere, Ethan made his move. He approached Lorana and knelt beside her as if examining her tools. "I'm working on a way out," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the clamor of the mines. Lorana froze. She didn't respond, her hands continuing to grip the pickaxe. "You're a fool," she finally muttered, her lips barely moving. "Maybe," Ethan admitted, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "But I'd rather be a fool trying to fix something than someone who does nothing." Lorana sighed, her hands trembling slightly. "If you fail, they'll kill you. They'll kill us all." "Then we won't fail," Ethan said firmly. "I need your help. You know this place better than anyone. You know the guards, the routines. Together, we can do this." For a long moment, Lorana said nothing. She wanted to tell him no, to tell him to leave her alone. But there was something in his voice, a determination that she hadn't heard in years. Against her better judgment, she nodded once, so small it was barely noticeable. That night, Ethan stayed up late in his quarters, working on the details of their plan. He hacked into the colony's security system, carefully avoiding detection, and found a weakness in the perimeter defenses. There was an abandoned maintenance tunnel leading out of the mines, long forgotten by the guards. If they could reach it, they had a chance to escape. The next day, Ethan shared the plan with Lorana during another whispered exchange. She listened intently, her sharp mind quickly picking apart the details. "The tunnel might be unguarded," she said, "but the entrance isn't. There's always at least 2 guards patrolling that area." "I'll handle the guards," Ethan said. "You just have to get the others ready." Lorana hesitated. "The others won't trust you. They barely trust each other. Most have given up hope of ever leaving this place." "Then we'll give them a reason to hope," Ethan replied. In the days that followed, Lorana quietly spread word of the plan among the prisoners. At first, many were skeptical. Escape seemed impossible, and the risk was too great. But as Ethan secretly worked to sabotage the security systems, and Lorana's confidence grew, so did theirs. One night, as the prisoners whispered in their cells about the upcoming escape, Lorana found herself staring at the stars through the tiny barred window of her cell. For the first time in years, the stars didn't look distant or unreachable. They looked like freedom. Ethan, meanwhile, sat at his console, running simulations and double-checking his sabotage. He knew the odds were against them, but he also knew that doing nothing wasn't an option. He thought of Lorana and the spark of hope he'd seen in her eyes. That hope was worth fighting for. The colony continued its cruel routine, unaware that beneath its surface, a rebellion was brewing. Ethan and Lorana's bond of defiance grew stronger with each passing day, setting the stage for a daring escape that would change their lives forever. The cold, dark tunnels of the mine were alive with quiet murmurs. Lorana moved carefully among the prisoners, speaking to them in whispers when the guards weren't looking. Her words carried a weight of urgency, but also a spark of something forgotten. Hope. Some prisoners nodded in agreement, their faces lighting up with cautious determination. Others remained skeptical, shaking their heads and returning to their work. Ethan watched from a distance, pretending to inspect a malfunctioning conveyor belt. His heart pounded every time a guard glanced his way, but he forced himself to stay calm. Every moment counted, and any misstep could destroy the fragile plan he and Lorana were building. That evening, under the cover of darkness, Lorana and Ethan met in a secluded corner of the tunnels. Lorana's sharp eyes scanned the area before she spoke, her voice low. "The others are scared, but some are willing to try. They'll follow us if we can convince them we have a real chance." Ethan nodded, his mind racing. "I've disabled part of the surveillance system near the maintenance tunnel. It should give us a window of about 20 minutes to get through before the system resets." "That's not much time," Lorana said, frowning. "It's all we have," Ethan replied. "I've also rigged a diversion. When we're ready to move, I'll trigger an overload in the mine's main power grid. The guards will be too busy dealing with the blackout to focus on us." Lorana raised an eyebrow, impressed despite herself. "You think of everything, don't you?" "I have to," Ethan said with a faint smile. "Failure isn't an option." But despite his confidence, doubt lingered in the back of Ethan's mind. The risks were immense. If the guards discovered their plan, it wouldn't just be his life on the line. It would be the lives of every prisoner involved. Yet, as he looked at Lorana, he saw the fire in her eyes, the unyielding will to fight for freedom. It gave him strength. Over the next few days, Ethan and Lorana fine-tuned their plan. Lorana worked to rally more prisoners, carefully choosing those she trusted. Each night, they gathered in secret to go over the details, their whispered discussions filled with tension and determination. One of the prisoners, a grizzled older man named Ral, was among the first to agree to the plan. "I've been here longer than anyone," he said, his voice rough but steady. "I've seen too many die with chains around their wrists. If there's a chance to get out, I'll take it." Others slowly joined, their fear tempered by the promise of escape. Each brought their own skills to the group. Ral knew the mine's tunnels better than anyone, while a younger prisoner named Tessa had a knack for spotting patterns in the guards' movements. Together, they formed a small but determined team. As the day of the escape approached, Ethan grew more anxious. Every detail had to be perfect. He spent long hours fine-tuning the power grid sabotage, making sure it would trigger the blackout without alerting the overseers too soon. His nights were restless, filled with dreams of alarms blaring and guards closing in. Lorana, too, felt the weight of the plan pressing down on her. She had spent years surviving, keeping her head down, and avoiding trouble. Now she was risking everything, not just for herself, but for the others who had placed their trust in her. She couldn't afford to fail them. On the eve of the escape, Lorana found Ethan working quietly in his quarters, surrounded by tools and blueprints. She hesitated before stepping inside. "You look tired," she said. Ethan glanced up, giving her a small, tired smile. "I'll rest when we're out of here." Lorana sat down across from him, her expression serious. "Why are you doing this, Ethan? You could leave this place and never think about us again. No one would blame you." Ethan set down his tools and met her gaze. "Because it's the right thing to do. I can't stand by and let this happen. Not when I can do something about it." His words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. Lorana studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Then we'll make it work, together." As they prepared for the final push, the air in the colony seemed to buzz with an unspoken tension. The guards carried on as usual, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath their feet. The prisoners moved through their routines with newfound purpose, their eyes sharper, their movements more deliberate. Ethan and Lorana knew the odds were against them. The colony was a fortress, and the Empire's grip was strong. But they also knew that freedom was worth any risk. As the first rays of dawn broke over the barren landscape, the stage was set. Tomorrow, everything would change. The colony was silent under the pale light of the moons. The guards patrolled their usual routes, their boots crunching on the rocky ground, unaware of the plan that was about to unfold. In the dark corners of the mines, a small group of prisoners huddled together, their hearts pounding with fear and anticipation. Ethan stood at the edge of the group, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the small device in his palm. It was a remote trigger for the power grid sabotage, his best work yet. The moment he pressed it, the entire mine would plunge into darkness. But timing was everything. One mistake, and the escape would be over before it began. Lorana moved among the prisoners, her sharp eyes scanning their faces. She could see the mix of emotions, fear, doubt, and the faint glimmer of hope. "Stay close. Follow the plan," she whispered. "This is our only chance." Ral, the grizzled old prisoner, nodded. "We're ready. Let's do this." Ethan took a deep breath and glanced at Lorana. "Are you sure about this?" She met his gaze, her expression steady. "No, but we can't stay here any longer. It's now or never." Ethan nodded and pressed the button. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the colony shook as the power grid overloaded. Lights flickered and died, plunging the tunnels into darkness. Alarms blared, and shouts echoed through the air as guards scrambled to respond to the sudden blackout. "Move," Lorana hissed, leading the group into the shadows. The prisoners moved quickly but carefully, sticking to the plan they had rehearsed in whispers. Raul took the lead, guiding them through the twisting tunnels toward the maintenance shaft. Ethan and Lorana stayed near the middle, keeping an eye on the group and listening for any signs of pursuit. They reached the first checkpoint, a narrow passage guarded by two heavily armed sentries. Ethan had anticipated this. He pulled out a small device from his pocket, one he had spent nights building. It emitted a high-pitched frequency that disoriented the guards, causing them to stumble and clutch their heads. Lorana wasted no time. She motioned for the group to move, and they slipped past the disoriented guards, their breaths shallow and quick. But the blackout wouldn't last forever. In the control center, the overseers worked frantically to restore power, barking orders into their comms. The guards were on high alert, and the prisoners knew it was only a matter of time before reinforcements arrived. As the group neared the maintenance shaft, their path was blocked by a security drone. Its glowing red eyes scanned the tunnel, and its weapons hummed with lethal energy. The prisoners froze, their fear palpable. Ethan stepped forward, his mind racing. "I can disable it," he whispered to Lorana. She grabbed his arm. "It's too dangerous. If it sees you." "It won't," he interrupted, determination in his voice. "Trust me." Lorana hesitated but finally nodded. Ethan crept forward, his hand steady despite the pounding of his heart. He pulled out a small EMP device he had rigged from scrap parts, praying it would work. As the drone turned toward him, Its sensors locking on, he activated the EMP. The device sparked, and the drone's lights flickered before it powered down, collapsing to the ground with a metallic thud. "Let's go," Ethan called, waving the group forward. They reached the maintenance shaft, a narrow tunnel that led to the surface. Raoul pried open the hatch with a crowbar, his old hands surprisingly strong. The prisoners began climbing one by one, their breaths ragged as they neared freedom. But the guards were closing in. The sound of boots echoed behind them, growing louder with every second. Lorana turned to Ethan. "Go. I'll hold them off." Ethan shook his head. "Not a chance. We stick together." The two of them stood at the base of the shaft, ready to fight if it came to that. But before the guards could reach them, Tessa, the sharp-eyed prisoner, pointed out an alternative route, a small side tunnel that led away from the main path. "Go," Ethan urged, pushing Lorana toward the side tunnel. The group split, with Ethan and Lorana leading the remaining prisoners through the narrow passage. It was cramped and dark, but it bought them precious time. Finally, they emerged into the open air. The cool wind hit their faces, carrying with it the scent of freedom. The stars stretched out above them, vast and endless. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, Raoul let out a laugh, rough and filled with disbelief. "We made it," he said, his voice trembling. But Lorana's eyes were on Ethan. "It's not over yet," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "Not until we're far from here." In the distance, the sounds of alarms and shouting still echoed. The prisoners had escaped the mines, but the real fight for freedom was just beginning. The cold night air hit the group like a wave as they stumbled out of the tunnels. For the first time in years, the prisoners felt the open sky above them, the stars shining down like distant beacons of hope. But there was no time to celebrate. The sound of alarms and shouting from the mine echoed across the barren landscape. Lorana turned to the group, her voice firm. "We need to move now. The guards will be on us any minute." Ethan pulled out a handheld device he'd modified, a crude map of the area displayed on its small screen. "There's an old supply depot a few kilometers from here. If we can reach it, we might find transport." Raoul, the older prisoner, nodded. "Let's hope your human machines are as reliable as you say." The group began to move, their footsteps crunching on the rocky terrain. The terrain was uneven, and the prisoners, weakened from years of labor, struggled to keep pace. Lorana stayed near the rear, helping those who stumbled. Ethan took the lead, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuers. It wasn't long before the distant hum of engines broke the fragile quiet. Lorana's heart sank. "They're coming," she said, her voice low. Ethan stopped and turned to the group. "We need to split up," he said quickly. "A smaller group will move faster and draw less attention. Lorana and I will lead the guards away. The rest of you head for the depot and wait for us there." "No," Lorana said sharply. "We're not splitting up. We either escape together or not at all." Ethan met her gaze, his expression resolute. "If we stay together, none of us will make it. Trust me on this." Lorana hesitated, her instincts screaming against the idea, but she knew he was right. She turned to Raoul and the others. "Go. We'll find you." The group reluctantly agreed, their faces filled with worry and gratitude. As they disappeared into the shadows, Ethan and Lorana stayed behind, preparing to face the incoming guards. Ethan crouched behind a rocky outcrop, pulling out a small makeshift device from his bag. "This is a proximity mine. It won't stop them, but it'll slow them down." Lorana watched as he placed the device carefully. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" "Let's hope I have enough left," Ethan replied with a grim smile. The engines grew louder, and the faint glow of headlights appeared in the distance. Lorana gripped the rusty pike she'd taken from the mines, her makeshift weapon. She glanced at Ethan, who was busy setting another trap. "Why are you doing this?" she asked suddenly. Ethan paused, looking up at her. "Because no one should live like this. Not you, not anyone. I can't change the whole galaxy, but I can do this." His words hung in the air for a moment before Lorana nodded. "Then let's make it count." The guards arrived moments later, their hovercrafts kicking up clouds of dust. As they dismounted, weapons drawn, the first proximity mine detonated with a deafening boom. The explosion sent the guards scattering, shouting orders and firing blindly into the darkness. Ethan and Lorana used the chaos to their advantage, slipping away under the cover of night. But the guards quickly regrouped, their searchlights sweeping the area. Ethan's breathing was ragged as he and Lorana sprinted across the rocky terrain. "We can't keep this up forever," he panted. Lorana glanced over her shoulder, her sharp eyes catching the movement of the guards closing in. "We just need to buy them enough time." As they reached the edge of a small ravine, Lorana stopped, her mind racing. "There," she said, pointing to a narrow path leading down into the ravine. "It's risky, but it might confuse them." Ethan didn't hesitate. "Let's go." The path was treacherous, the loose rocks slipping under their feet as they descended. The guards hesitated at the edge, shouting into their comms for backup. Lorana and Ethan used the delay to put more distance between them and their pursuers. When they reached the bottom, Ethan collapsed against a boulder, gasping for air. "I'm not built for this kind of cardio," he muttered. Lorana allowed herself a small smile, despite the situation. "You're doing fine. Better than most." Their brief respite was cut short by the distant sound of footsteps. The guards were still coming. Lorana helped Ethan to his feet, her expression resolute. "We're not done yet." Together, they pressed on, every step taking them closer to freedom, or to their end. The first rays of dawn painted the horizon in soft hues of orange and pink as Ethan and Lorana reached the outskirts of the old supply depot. The worn structure stood like a forgotten sentinel in the barren wasteland, its walls battered by years of neglect. Ethan leaned against a rusted beam, his chest heaving with exhaustion. Lorana stood beside him, scanning their surroundings with sharp, alert eyes. The distant hum of engines had faded, but they knew it wouldn't be long before the guards found their trail again. "We don't have much time," Lorana said, her voice steady despite her fatigue. Ethan nodded, forcing himself to stand. "Let's find the others." Inside the depot, the rest of the escapees huddled together, their faces lighting up with relief when they saw Lorana and Ethan enter. Rawl stepped forward, his expression grim but hopeful. "We didn't think you'd make it," he admitted. "Neither did we," Ethan replied with a faint smile. Tessa, the sharp-eyed young prisoner, pointed toward a corner of the depot where a dusty transport vehicle stood. "We found this. It's old, but it might still work." Ethan's eyes lit up. "Let me see." He quickly examined the vehicle, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. The engine was intact, though it hadn't been used in years. With some adjustments and a bit of luck, it might just get them out of the colony's reach. Lorana approached as Ethan worked, her voice low. "Can it run?" "It's not ideal, but it'll do," Ethan replied, wiping grease from his hands. "We'll need to move fast. The guards won't stop searching." As the group prepared to leave, a distant explosion shook the ground. Dust fell from the depot's ceiling, and the prisoners froze. Lorana's heart sank. They'd found us. Ethan tightened his grip on the wrench in his hand, his jaw clenching. "We need to leave. Now." The prisoners piled into the transport, their movements frantic but determined. Ethan took the driver's seat, with Lorana beside him. The vehicle sputtered to life with a loud cough, then roared as Ethan pressed the accelerator. The transport tore across the rocky landscape, the wind whipping through the open windows. Behind them, the distant glow of searchlights grew brighter. Lorana twisted in her seat, her sharp eyes catching the movement of pursuing vehicles. "They're gaining on us," she said, her voice tense. Ethan pushed the vehicle harder, the engine protesting under the strain. "Hold on," he shouted. As the guards closed in, Lorana spotted a narrow canyon ahead. It was a dangerous route, but it could give them the advantage they needed. She pointed. "There. If we can get through, they might not follow." Ethan didn't hesitate, steering the transport toward the canyon. The vehicle swerved dangerously as it entered the narrow pass, the walls closing in around them. The pursuing guards hesitated, their larger vehicles unable to navigate the tight space. The transport burst out of the canyon into open terrain, the rising sun casting long shadows across the landscape. For the first time, the searchlights faded behind them, and the sound of engines disappeared. Ethan slowed the transport, his hands trembling on the wheel. The prisoners sat in stunned silence, their faces a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. Lorana turned to Ethan, her voice soft. "We did it." Ethan nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Yeah, we did." The transport came to a stop near a shallow ridge, overlooking a vast plain dotted with scattered vegetation. The group climbed out, taking in the sight of the open land. Land that wasn't controlled by the Empire. Land that meant freedom. Rahl stepped forward, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile. "We're free," he said, the words heavy with emotion. Tessa laughed, her voice ringing out like a melody. "I can't believe it. We're actually free." Lorana stood apart from the group, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The wind tugged at her hair, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel something she thought she'd lost forever. Hope. Ethan joined her, his expression thoughtful. "What now?" he asked. Lorana turned to him, her violet eyes shimmering in the morning light. "We rebuild. We find others like us and show them that freedom is possible." Ethan smiled. "You've got a lot of fight in you." "So do you," Lorana replied. As the sun rose higher, the group began to move, their steps lighter than before. They didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but they knew they weren't alone. Together, they had faced the impossible and won. For the first time, Lorana felt the weight of her chains truly lift. She looked at Ethan, her unlikely ally, and knew that he had changed everything. Not just for her, but for all of them. Freedom wasn't just a dream anymore. It was theirs, and they would fight to keep it.